Katharina Hoffmann had never believed that she would remarry at the age of 38. Her first marriage had ended 6 years ago, quietly and without drama, simply through the gradual fading of what had once been love. After that, she had concentrated on her work, on her small bookshop in Freiburg's old town, on the familiar rhythms of a life that was safe and predictable. She had come to terms with being alone, had learned to appreciate the silence of her apartment, the gentle ticking of the wall clock, the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the morning. Then Stefan Berger had entered her life, and suddenly everything had changed. She had met him on a Thursday afternoon in March. The bookstore had been almost empty, only the muffled sound of rain outside the windows breaking the silence. He had come in, his dark hair damp from the weather, a black coat over his arm, and asked for a first edition of Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks. His voice had been calm, cultured, with a precision that Katharina had immediately noticed. He didn't speak quickly. Every word seemed carefully chosen. When she took the book off the shelf for him, he smiled, a reserved, almost shy smile that didn't quite reach his green eyes. They talked about literature, about the great German authors, about the changes in the book trade, about digitalization, which was engulfing everything. He told her about his work, vaguely and without details. He was a consultant, he had said, for medium-sized companies, mainly in the field of logistics and supply chain management. His work often took him through southern Germany, sometimes as far as Austria and Switzerland. Freiburg was an oasis of calm for him, a place where he could switch off when projects became too stressful. Stefan had come back 3 weeks later, this time without rain, but with the same quiet politeness. He had bought another book, this time by Hesse, and while paying he had asked her if she would like to go out to dinner with him. Katharina had hesitated in surprise, but then agreed. The dinner had been pleasant, in a small Italian restaurant near the university, where the light was warm and subdued, and the waiters remained discreetly in the background. Stefan had listened, really listened when she spoke. He had asked questions that showed he was interested in her opinion, in her past. He hadn't tried to impress her, hadn't talked about himself unless she asked directly. There was something reassuring about this restraint. In the months that followed, a relationship developed that Katharina hardly dared to believe at first. Stefan was reliable, attentive, patient. He never showed up unannounced, respected her time and her space. When he traveled, he sent short messages, nothing excessive, just a few lines to show that he was thinking of her. He brought her flowers, but not opulent bouquets, just single roses, carefully selected. He cooked for her, simple but perfectly prepared dishes, and cleaned up the kitchen afterwards without her having to ask. He had no visible quirks, no sudden mood swings, no hidden aggression. He was, as her friend Clara once remarked, almost too perfect. Clara Neumann had been Katharina's closest confidant since school. She worked as a lawyer in Freiburg and had a sharp, analytical mind that left little room for romance. When Katharina told her about Stefan, Clara was initially skeptical. She asked questions about his family, his previous relationships, his friends. Stefan had answered all her questions, but always briefly. His parents had died, he had said, in a car accident years ago. He had no siblings. His work took up so much of his time that he hardly had any opportunity to cultivate close friendships. Most of his colleagues were business contacts, not friends in the true sense of the word. Clara frowned. "That sounds lonely," she said. Stefan just smiled and said that he had learned to deal with loneliness. It didn't bother him. He didn't need much, just peace and quiet and good company now and then. Katharina accepted this answer. She understood what it meant to be alone, understood the advantages, the freedom, the independence. She didn't probe any further. In September, 6 months after they had met, Stefan proposed to her. It didn't happen in a restaurant, in front of an audience, with a grand gesture. They had been hiking in the Black Forest on a Sunday morning, on a narrow path that led through a dense fir forest. The air smelled of moss and earth, and the light filtered through the treetops, golden and soft. Stefan had stopped, looked at her, and said quietly that he believed she was the person he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. No flowers, no ring at that moment, just those simple words. Katerina had cried without knowing why, maybe out of relief, maybe out of happiness, maybe out of an undefined fear she couldn't name. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on October 12th. It was a small ceremony at the registry office in Freiburg, with only Clara and a colleague of Stefan's as witnesses. The colleague, a man named Jörg Stahl, was polite but distant. He stayed only briefly after the ceremony, offered a terse congratulations, and then disappeared, saying he had to get back to Stuttgart. Katerina had found him strange, his presence somehow forced, as if he had come not out of friendship, but out of duty. After the wedding, Katerina moved into Stefan's house. It was located on the outskirts of town, in a quiet neighborhood near Günterstall, surrounded by old oak trees and tall hedges. The house itself was new, modern, and minimalist, with large windows and clean lines. Inside it was sparsely furnished, functional, almost sterile. The walls were white, the furniture dark and heavy. There were no photos, no personal items, nothing that told a story. Katerina had tried to bring in some of her own things, a few books, a small plant, a framed drawing she had bought at a flea market. Stefan hadn't said anything against it, but she sensed that he didn't like it. He sometimes moved her things, putting them back in places that seemed more logical, more symmetrical. The first few days in the house were strange. Katerina felt like a visitor, not a resident. Stefan worked a lot, often leaving early in the morning and coming back late. He had a study on the first floor, a room he always locked when he left. Katerina had once asked if she could go in to see how he worked, and Stefan had refused, kindly but firmly. There were confidential documents there, he had explained, contracts, financial reports, all strictly confidential. He couldn't risk anyone, even accidentally, seeing something that wasn't meant for strangers' eyes. Katerina understood. She herself had areas of her life that were private, thoughts she didn't share, memories that belonged only to her. She accepted that Stefan set boundaries. What she did not accept, at least not without a dull uneasiness, was the silence in the house. It was not the pleasant silence of her old apartment, not the peaceful solitude. It was a different kind of silence, heavy and observant, as if the house itself were breathing and waiting. On the 4th day after the wedding, something strange happened. Katerina had been home alone. Stefan was on a business trip to Munich. She had decided to get to know the house better, rummaging through the closets, looking for space for her clothes. In the basement, in a narrow storage room, she had found a locked chest, old and heavy, made of dark wood. Curious, she had tried to open it, but it was firmly locked, the lock rusted or deliberately blocked. She hadn't thought anything of it, had covered the chest again and gone upstairs. In the evening, when Stefan returned, she had casually mentioned that she had explored the basement. His reaction had been immediate. His face had changed, becoming hard, his eyes narrow. He had looked at her, long and without blinking, and then asked if she had touched anything. Katerina had shaken her head, surprised by his tone. No, she had said, just looked. Stefan had relaxed, but not completely. He had explained to her that there were old documents in the basement, things belonging to his family that he hadn't sorted through yet. It was emotionally difficult for him to deal with them. She should please not go downstairs without him. Katerina had agreed, but the episode had unsettled her. It wasn't the request itself, but the intensity of his reaction, the sudden coldness in his voice. She hadn't recognized Stefan in that moment, had seen something lurking beneath the calm surface, something sharp and controlling. She couldn't sleep that night. She lay next to Stefan, listening to his steady breathing, and thought about the chest in the basement, the study that was always locked, the absence of photos, of the past, of life in this house. She thought of Clara, who had said before the wedding that she didn't really know Stefan yet, that 6 months was too short a time to understand a person. Katerina had laughed and replied that life was too short to wait for certainties. Now, in the dark, she wondered if Clara had been right. She turned to the side, looked at Stefan's profile, the sharp lines of his face, his closed eyelids. He looked peaceful, almost vulnerable. Katerina reached out, touched his shoulder, and he didn't move. He was fast asleep, or pretending to be. The next morning, Stefan got up early. Katerina heard him showering, heard the sounds from the kitchen, smelled the coffee. When she came downstairs, he was already dressed in a dark suit, a briefcase in his hand. He smiled at her, kissed her on the forehead, and said he had to work longer today, possibly late into the night. She shouldn't worry, he would call. Then he was gone, and Katerina stood alone in the kitchen, coffee in hand, looking out the window at the empty street. The hours passed slowly. She tried to read, tried to watch TV, tried to call Clara, but her friend was in a meeting. The house felt bigger when Stefan wasn't there. The rooms seemed to expand, the shadows to deepen. In the afternoon, Katerina decided to go for a walk. She put on her jacket, left the house, and walked down the street, past the neat front yards, the well-tended hedges, the quiet houses. She had been walking for about 20 minutes when she met an elderly woman walking her dog, a small terrier that barked excitedly. The woman smiled at Katerina and stopped. She introduced herself as Mrs. Lindner, said she lived 2 streets away and knew most of the neighbors. She had heard that someone had moved into the house at the end of the street, Mr. Berger's house. Katerina nodded and said she was his wife. Mrs. Lindner looked surprised, then interested. "Oh, married," she said. "That's nice." Mr. Berger had always been such a quiet man, very reserved, hardly ever seen. She had rarely spoken to him, usually just a greeting in passing. Katerina asked how long Mrs. Lindner had known him. The older woman thought about it. 3 years, maybe 4. He had moved in shortly after the house was finished. At first there had been more activity, deliveries, craftsmen, but then it had become quiet. Sometimes she saw his car drive away, sometimes he came back late, but otherwise, nothing. No visitors, no celebrations, no signs of life. The conversation ended soon. Mrs. Lindner said goodbye and moved on, the dog tugging at its leash. Katerina stood still, looked back at the house, and a strange feeling spread through her chest. No visitors, no signs of life. She thought of the wedding, of the only witness who had barely stayed. She thought of the missing photos, the locked rooms, the chest in the basement. When she returned to the house, it had grown dark. Stefan hadn't called. She tried to reach him, but his cell phone was turned off. She ate dinner alone, a simple sandwich with cheese, and then sat in the living room, the lights dimmed, and waited. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a small blow against the silence. At midnight she heard the key in the door. Stefan came in, his face tired, his clothes still neat. He apologized, saying the meeting had taken longer than planned. Katerina nodded, said nothing. He went straight upstairs, took a shower, and then came to bed. They lay next to each other without touching, and Katerina stared at the ceiling. That night, she dreamed of the chest in the basement. In her dream it was open, and inside were things she couldn't see, only feel, a heavy, dark presence creeping upward, through the floorboards, through the walls, into her bedroom. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, and saw that Stefan was looking at her, awake, his eyes open in the dark. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. Katerina nodded, unable to speak. Stefan turned to the side, and after a while she heard his breathing become steady again. But she couldn't fall asleep. She lay there until the first light of morning seeped through the curtains, knowing that something was wrong without being able to name what it was. The following days were marked by a strange tension that lay like a thin layer over everything. Stefan behaved normally, at least on the surface. He got up early, went to work, came back in the evening, sometimes cooked, watched TV, went to sleep. But Katerina noticed little things, details that hadn't been there before or that she had overlooked. His phone calls, for example. When his cell phone rang, he immediately left the room, went outside or into his study, and closed the door behind him. His voice was muffled, his words incomprehensible. Once, Katerina had tried to eavesdrop, quietly climbing the stairs and standing next to the door. She had only heard fragments, individual words. Confirmed. Schedule. No complications. Then there was sudden silence, and the door opened. Stefan was standing right in front of her, cell phone in hand, his face expressionless. He said nothing, just walked past her and down the stairs. Katerina felt her heart pounding in her chest. On Saturday, a week after the wedding, Katerina suggested they go shopping together, maybe go to a cafe afterwards. Stefan had refused, saying he had to work, even on weekends. She was welcome to go alone. He would join her later. Katerina was disappointed, but didn't insist. She drove into town alone, did her shopping, and met Clara in a small cafe near the cathedral. Clara immediately noticed that something was wrong. She knew Katerina too well, could read the tension in her face, the way she played with her cup without drinking. "What's wrong?" Clara asked directly. Katerina hesitated, not knowing where to start. "It's hard to explain," she finally said. "Stefan is wonderful, attentive, never aggressive, but there are moments when she feels like she doesn't know him at all. The locked rooms, the lack of friends, the secrecy." Clara leaned back, her arms crossed. "Have you tried talking to him about it?" she asked. Katerina nodded. She had tried, but Stefan always evaded the subject, steered the conversation in other directions, or became silent, so silent that it became uncomfortable. Clara was silent for a moment, then said something that startled Katerina. "If you have doubts so soon after the wedding, you should be careful. People often only show their true colors when they feel secure, when they think the other person can't leave." Katerina wanted to disagree, wanted to defend Stefan, but the words stuck in her throat. She thought of the night he had watched her in the dark, of his reaction to the basement, of the absence of life in his house. Clara noticed her hesitation and leaned forward. "Listen," she said quietly, "I'm not blaming you for marrying him, but if anything happens, if you need help, call me. No matter when, no matter where." Katerina nodded, tried to smile, but it felt wrong. They said goodbye, and Katerina drove back home, the shopping bags heavy on the passenger seat. When she arrived, Stefan's car wasn't in the driveway. The house was empty, all the lights off. She carried the bags inside, put the groceries away, and suddenly noticed that the door to the study was open. Just a crack, but definitely open. Katerina stopped, staring at the narrow strip of darkness behind the door. Stefan always locked this room, without exception. Had he forgotten this time, or was it intentional? She knew she shouldn't go in, that it was a boundary she wasn't allowed to cross, but curiosity got the better of her. She walked slowly up the stairs, each step deliberately quiet, as if someone might hear her. She pushed the door open further. The room was dark, the blinds down. She fumbled for the light switch, hesitated, then pressed it. The light flickered briefly, then illuminated the room. It was larger than she had thought, with a massive desk in the middle, a bookcase against the wall, a filing cabinet in the corner. Everything was neat, almost obsessively tidy. No dust, no loose papers, no personal items. Katerina stepped closer to the desk. On it lay an open laptop with a black screen. Next to it was a notepad, empty. She opened the top drawer, carefully, as if she might set off an alarm. Inside were pens, paper clips, a USB stick. Nothing unusual. The second drawer was locked. She pulled on it, but it didn't budge. She turned to the bookshelf. The books were arranged by subject: business administration, logistics, psychology, criminology. Criminology. Katerina pulled out one of the books and opened it. It was annotated with notes in the margins and passages underlined. She read one of them. The organized perpetrator plans methodically, avoids risks, and controls every variable. Her breath caught in her throat. She put the book back and pulled out another one. Same pattern, notes, underlining. This time about forensic psychology, about offender profiles. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to leave the room, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She went to the filing cabinet and pulled on the top drawer. Locked. The second one, too. The third one gave way. Inside were folders labeled with years. She pulled one out, 2021, and opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed articles, all on the same topic: missing persons. Women, different age groups, different cities in southern Germany. Stuttgart, Karlsruhe, Heidelberg, Freiburg. Katerina's hands were shaking. She leafed through it, found more articles, more faces, some marked in red, others with handwritten notes. March. Successful. No traces. She couldn't breathe. The air seemed to thicken, suffocating. Suddenly she heard a noise from downstairs, the front door opening. Stefan was back. Panic overwhelmed her. She stuffed the articles back into the folder, pushed it into the cupboard, and closed the drawer. She ran to the door, turned off the light, pulled the door shut but not completely, leaving it as she had found it. Then she hurried down the stairs, trying to appear calm, trying to breathe. Stefan was standing in the kitchen, putting down his bag. He smiled at her. "Sorry I was gone so long," he said. The meeting ran late. Katerina nodded, unable to speak. Her face must have been pale. Her hands were still shaking. Stefan noticed. "Is everything okay?" he asked, stepping closer. Katerina instinctively backed away. "Yes," she said quickly, "just tired." Stefan looked at her long and intently. Then he nodded slowly. "You should lie down," he said. "I'll make us something to eat later." Katerina went upstairs to the bedroom, closed the door behind her and leaned against it. Her heart was racing, her thoughts were racing. The articles, the notes, the markings, missing women. She reached for her cell phone, dialed Clara's number, but then paused. What should she say? That her husband collects newspaper articles? That was no proof, no crime. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe he was working on a project, a study. She tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that her fear was making her see things that weren't there, but deep down she knew that something was terribly wrong. And she knew she was in danger. Katerina didn't leave the bedroom that evening. She heard Stefan bustling about downstairs in the kitchen, heard the clattering of dishes, smelled the aroma of roasted vegetables wafting through the house. He called upstairs that dinner was ready, but she replied that she wasn't feeling well and just wanted to sleep. There was silence. Then she heard his footsteps on the stairs. He knocked softly on the door and opened it a crack. "Can I bring you anything?" he asked, his voice gentle and concerned. "No, thank you," she whispered. "Just peace and quiet." He withdrew, and she heard him go back downstairs. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, every sound in the house deafeningly loud in her ears. The ticking of the clock, the creaking of the floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator. Her mind worked feverishly, trying to find explanations, rational reasons for what she had seen. Maybe Stefan had been a journalist before he became a consultant. Maybe he was researching for a book, an article. But then she remembered the notes. Successful. No traces. What did that mean? Successful at what? She grabbed her cell phone, opened the browser, and searched for the name she had seen in the articles. Julia Kraus, missing since March 2021, last seen in Stuttgart. Melanie Vogel disappeared in June of the same year in Karlsruhe. The reports were brief, official police reports, appeals to witnesses. None of the women had ever been found. Katerina scrolled further, found more names, more faces, all between 30 and 40 years old, all living alone, all without close relatives. A pattern. There was a pattern. She felt nauseous. She got up, went to the bathroom, knelt in front of the toilet. But nothing came. Just dry retching, cold sweat on her forehead. She heard Stefan on the stairs, his footsteps coming closer. "Katerina," he asked through the door, "are you okay?" She forced herself to answer. "Yes, just a little nauseous." He offered to bring her medicine, but she refused. He paused for a moment, then walked away. She made it back to bed, pulled the blanket up to her chin, even though she wasn't cold. She had to think, had to make a plan. She couldn't just stay, not in this house, not with him. But if she left now in the middle of the night, he would become suspicious. She had to wait until tomorrow, had to pretend everything was normal, then find an excuse to leave the house, go to Clara's, call the police. The night dragged on endlessly. Stefan came to bed at some point, lay down next to her, said nothing. She kept her eyes closed, breathed evenly, pretended to be asleep. She felt him move, turn on his side, his hand briefly touch her shoulder, then pull away. Hours passed. She must have fallen asleep at some point because when she woke up, it was light and Stefan was gone. She sat up and listened. The house was quiet. She got up, got dressed, and went downstairs. There was a note on the kitchen table. At an appointment, back in the afternoon. S. Katerina exhaled, a wave of relief washing over her. She was alone. She could leave. She ran upstairs, grabbed a bag, stuffed clothes into it at random, her wallet, her cell phone charger. Then she paused. She had to take evidence with her, something that would convince the police. She went to the study, but the door was locked again. She cursed softly and tried to break it open, but the lock was solid. She needed the key. She searched the bedroom, the dresser, the nightstand, found nothing. Then she remembered Stefan's jacket hanging in the hallway. She ran downstairs, searched the pockets, found a set of keys. Back upstairs to the door, she tried one key after another. On the fourth, it clicked, the door opened. She entered, went straight to the filing cabinet, pulled open the drawer, and took out the folder. She photographed the pages with her cell phone, every single one, her hands shaking so badly that some of the pictures came out blurry. She continued, forcing herself to remain calm and precise. Then she heard it. A car in the driveway. Stefan was back. Panic. She stuffed the folder back in, closed the drawer, ran to the door, cell phone still in her hand. She heard the front door open, Stefan's footsteps in the hallway. She made it down the stairs, trying to act natural, but her face must have betrayed her fear. Stefan stood in the living room, looking at her. "You're awake," he said neutrally. Katerina nodded, pressing the cell phone behind her back. "I thought you were coming home later," she said, her voice too high. "The appointment was over sooner," Stefan replied. He stepped closer, and she backed away. His eyes narrowed. "What are you doing, Katerina?" "Nothing," she said. "I was just about to go out and buy a few things." Stefan looked at her bag, which was standing in the bedroom, visible through the open door. A large bag, much too big for shopping. His gaze returned to her, cold, analytical. "You're lying," he said quietly. Katerina shook her head, backing away further toward the front door. Stefan moved quickly, placing himself between her and the exit. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice now different, flat, emotionless. Katerina remained silent, her heart pounding. Stefan stepped closer, grabbed her arm, pulled her toward him. "Show me your phone," he ordered. She tried to break free, but his grip was iron. "Give it to me," he repeated. Katerina screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound. She broke free, ran to the door, managed to open it, and stumbled outside. Stefan followed her quickly, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. She ran down the street, screaming for help, but the houses remained silent, the windows closed. She heard him behind her, too close, much too close. Then a car turned the corner. Katerina waved desperately, and the car stopped. It was Mrs. Lindner, the elderly neighbor. She got out, saw Katerina, then Stefan, who stopped abruptly. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Lindner asked, alarmed. Katerina nodded breathlessly, tried to smile. "Yes, just a misunderstanding." Stefan smiled too, charmingly, controlled. "My wife got scared," he said. "Everything's fine." Mrs. Lindner looked back and forth between them, uncertain. Katerina seized the moment, got into her own car, which was parked in the driveway, and started the engine. Stefan called her name, but she drove off quickly without looking back. She drove straight to Clara's. Clara opened the door and froze. Katerina stood in front of her, her face pale, her hair disheveled, tears streaming down her cheeks. She pulled her friend inside, locked the door, and led her into the living room. "What happened?" Clara asked urgently. At first, Katerina couldn't speak, just sobbed, her hands trembling. Clara fetched some water and waited patiently for Katerina to compose herself. Then Katerina told her everything: the open study, the books on criminology, the filing cabinet, the newspaper articles about missing women, the notes marked "successful" and "no traces," Stefan's reaction when he caught her, the chase, the escape. Clara listened silently, her face growing increasingly serious. "Show me the photos," she finally said. Katerina took out her cell phone and opened the gallery. Clara scrolled through the pictures, slowly, intently. Her legal training allowed her to notice details that Katerina had overlooked. The data was chronological, the markings systematic. "This is no coincidence," Clara murmured. "This is documentation." She looked up. "We have to go to the police right now." Katerina hesitated. What if they didn't believe her? What if Stefan had an explanation, a plausible story? Clara shook her head. "These women have disappeared, Katerina, real people, and your husband collects articles about them, takes notes as if they were projects. That's more than suspicious. That's enough evidence for an investigation." They drove together to the police station in the city center. The officer on duty, a man in his mid-50s with grey temples, listened to Katerina's story with growing skepticism. He noted down details, looked at the photos, frowned. "That's not much," he said cautiously. "Collecting newspaper articles is not a crime. Maybe your husband is an amateur detective, interested in unsolved cases." "But the notes," Katerina insisted. "Successful? No traces." "What does that mean?" The officer shrugged. "Hard to say without context." Clara intervened, her lawyer's voice sharp and precise. "These women have been missing for years. No one has ever been found. My client is in danger. That should be enough for at least an interview." The officer sighed, picked up the phone, and spoke quietly to someone. Then he hung up. "We'll send someone to talk to your husband," he said to Katerina, "but you have to understand, this is a routine interview, not an indictment." Katerina nodded, relieved and frightened at the same time. What if Stefan was charming again, convincing as always? Clara led her outside, back to the car. "You're staying with me today," she said firmly. "No arguments." Katerina was grateful, unable to resist. Her cell phone vibrated, a message from Stefan. "We need to talk. Please come home. It's not what you think." She deleted the message and turned off her phone. Clara put a hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. Katerina wanted to believe it, but deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning, and that Stefan wouldn't just give up. The next morning, Clara's phone rang. It was the police. "Katerina should come immediately," the voice said urgently. They drove to the station in silence. The officer from yesterday was waiting for them, his face tense. "We questioned your husband," he began. "He was cooperative and explained everything. He said the articles were for private research, a book project about unsolved cases." Katerina wanted to protest, but the officer raised his hand. However, we also searched his house, with his consent. He pointed to a table on which objects were laid out. Jewelry, personal items, a driver's license, everything belonged to the missing women. Katerina's breath caught in her throat, and in the basement the officer continued, his voice now softer. We opened the chest. His gaze was heavy. What we found inside confirms our worst suspicions. Stefan Berger has been arrested. You are safe. Katerina collapsed. Clara's arms held her. She had married a serial killer, and it had only taken her 7 days to find out. 7 days before she herself would have disappeared. The following weeks were a fog of interrogations, statements, media reports. Stefan Berger, the quiet consultant, the man with no past, was identified as one of the most wanted serial killers in southern Germany. The police found the remains of 3 women in the chest in the basement. DNA matches confirmed their identities. Julia Kraus, Melanie Vogel, Sarah Zimmerman. All had died in his house, systematically, methodically, without leaving any traces. The investigators reconstructed his modus operandi. Stefan had carefully selected his victims. Women with no close family ties, living alone, vulnerable. He had observed them for months, gained their trust, isolated them. The killings always followed the same pattern, quick, efficient, in a sealed room in the basement that Katerina had never seen. The bodies were carefully preserved, their personal belongings kept as trophies. Katerina learned these details during the investigation, each revelation a new blow. She had slept, eaten and loved in this house, just meters away from the remains of murdered women. The thought kept her awake at night, haunted her in dreams that turned into nightmares. The trial began in the spring. Stefan showed no remorse, no emotion. He denied nothing, explaining his actions as the logical consequence of a need for control. The prosecution described him as a highly intelligent, psychopathic perpetrator without empathy. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment with subsequent preventive detention. Katerina did not appear at the sentencing. She had left Germany and moved in with her sister in Austria, needing distance from everything that reminded her of those 7 days. Clara visited her regularly, helping her to build a new life, slowly, step by step. Months later, Katerina sat in a cafe in Salzburg, looking up at the fortress, thinking of the women who had not escaped. She thought of the moments when she should have become suspicious, the warning signs she had overlooked. But she also thought about how she had survived, how her instincts, her curiosity, her fear had saved her. She would never forget what had happened. But she would go on living, for herself, for the women whose voices had been silenced. And she would never again trust anyone blindly, never again mistake silence for peace. Life went on, even after the abyss. Slowly, with scars, but it went on.